Today, many Americans are asking, indeed, I asked myself, how could this happen? How could this happen in a country we helped liberate, in a city we helped save from destruction?
Right now on Andrea Mitchell Reports, President Obama orders increased security at U.S. embassies around the world after violent protests in Egypt and Libya leave 4 Americans dead, including the United States ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens.
As Americans, let us never, ever forget that our freedom is only sustained because there are people who are willing to fight for it, to stand up for it, and in some cases, lay down their lives for it.
The attack set off by an anti-Muslim video posted on YouTube that mocks the Prophet Muhammad.
Let me be clear. There is no justification for this. None. Violence like this is no way to honor religion or faith.
The crisis sparking a political firestorm. Before President Obama even spoke, Mitt Romney went on the attack over the administration's response.
They clearly sent mixed messages to the world, and the statement that came from the administration, and the embassy is the administration. The statement that came from the administration was a statement which is akin to apology, and I think was a severe miscalculation.
On Capitol Hill, honoring the heroes, the American flag lowered to half-staff in memory of the lives lost. Good day. It is a somber day in Washington and around the world for American diplomats. Flanked by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, President Obama condemned the attack in Benghazi that led to the deaths of 4 Americans, including the United States ambassador, Chris Stevens.
We will not waver in our commitment to see that justice is done for this terrible act, and make no mistake, justice will be done.
Joining me now, NBC Chief Foreign Correspondent Richard Engel in Cairo, and here at the table, Nicholas Burns, former ambassador to NATO and a professor of diplomacy and international politics at the Harvard Kennedy School. First to you, Richard, you've been out there all day. Tell me about what's happening in Cairo right now and your recap of what sparked the attacks both in Cairo and Benghazi.
I think it's important to differentiate between the two because they're very different kinds of demonstrations and attacks. Right now in Cairo, there is still a demonstration going on. A couple hundred, maybe not even that many, hardline supporters. Most of them were members of the Jamaah Islamiyya, the Islamic group, supporters of the old blind cleric Omar Abdurrahman, if you remember that name from the first World Trade Center attack. They have been organizing demonstrations in front of the U.S. Embassy for a long time now, and they were the core group that went out yesterday, organized this demonstration, and then the demonstration got out of hand, so to speak, and some of the people climbed into the embassy itself, didn't attack anyone, but pulled down an American flag and put up a black Islamic flag. No U.S. personnel were at risk in that incident, but what it did show was a glaring lack of response from the new Islamic-leaning Egyptian government. What happened in Benghazi was a very different kind of attack. This was a commando raid, according to accounts by the Libyan, by various Libyan security officials, including ones we've spoken to, who describe commandos, militants showing up, attacking with RPGs, with military-style formation, at least 2 phases of the attack. It's a different kind of thing. I'm not saying that they both were inspired, we are told, by this internet video, but one was a popular feeling, an agitation in which people climbed over a wall and pulled down a flag. The other was looks more like an Al-Qaeda style raid on a consulate that ended up killing the ambassador and other personnel.
Now, we understand the president, as you know, has issued orders to increase security at embassies around the world. We understand that at 7 particular embassies in the Middle East. and in the region at large, that security is increasing, let's say, even more than you would in other places around the world. What is the reaction in the Arab street? Because there's going to be a lot of very fierce reaction here at home.
The reaction in the Arab street, I think, is always surprising. There's the adage that in the Middle East, no good deed goes unpunished. And I think a lot of people a lot of Americans would be surprised to know what is emerging in the Arab street. The Arab street, which is a complicated thing in itself, for decades under the U.S.-friendly dictators, were undereducated. They were fed a steady diet of anti-Americanism, anti-Israeli sentiment, anti-Zionist sentiment, certainly. And when you give people freedom of expression, you are also empowering these fringe groups. So already there have been small demonstrations in Tunisia by the U.S. Embassy. In Gaza City, there was some demonstrations. Karzai in Afghanistan took steps to limit YouTube, so the Afghan people wouldn't see these videos, and they're back out on the streets. Whenever that happens in Kabul, people tend to die. So there is certainly an empowered radical element that the U.S., now that there's a new Arab Spring reality in this region, is going to struggle to deal with, I think, for a very long time.
Richard Engel and Nick Burns here in Washington. There is a very big political controversy over Mitt Romney's criticism. He issued a statement around 10 o'clock last night, and a written statement, and then today went on television before President Obama did, around 10:15 this morning, reacting to a statement that was issued by the Cairo Embassy. The Cairo Embassy statement came out at 12:17 local time yesterday. It was, by the statement of the embassy, a preemptive statement. They hoped to avoid protests that they anticipated because of this YouTube video that was promulgated with anti-Muslim information in it. The statement by the U.S. Embassy in Cairo that was so roundly criticized and was disgraceful, according to Mitt Romney, was an apology, according to Mitt Romney, and was put at the feet of the President of the United States by Mitt Romney, says in part that the embassy in Cairo condemns the continuing efforts by misguided individuals to hurt the religious feelings of Muslims, as we condemn efforts to offend believers of all religions. Today, the 11th anniversary of September 11th, Americans are honoring our patriots, those who serve our nation, as the fitting response to the enemies of democracy. Respect for religious beliefs is a cornerstone of American democracy. We firmly reject the actions by those who abuse the universal right of free speech to hurt the religious beliefs of others. This was released by the embassy in Cairo, apparently without Washington's approval, 6 hours before the protests, not as an apology for the protests or an explanation or response. You've been in embassies around the world. You've been at the top levels of the State Department in Washington. First of all, do the press officers at embassies have the authority to release a statement like that if intelligence and other information indicates that they may be experiencing protests?
Well, they certainly do. And Andrea, we have one of the most experienced and outstanding American diplomats in Cairo as our ambassador, Ann Patterson. It's her responsibility and the responsibility of our embassy to make the statements they have to make, in this case, to protect and defend our embassy and the people in it.
Now, Ann Patterson was on home leave. That's we've just discovered. So she, if she's on home leave, probably would not have been conferred.
She probably would. If she was on home leave, she wouldn't have been the person authorizing that. But I think the larger point here is this. This is a tragic day for our country and for our Foreign Service. 4 outstanding Americans have been killed. And I was, frankly, very disappointed and dismayed to see Governor Romney inject politics into this very difficult situation where our embassies are under attack, where there's been a big misunderstanding in the Middle East, apparently, about an American film, where we're trying to preserve the lives of our diplomats. This is no time for politics. I watched Secretary Clinton's statement this morning, and I read President Obama's statement, and I've looked at the statement that you've just referred to, issued 24 hours ago by our embassy in Cairo. In no way, shape, or form is the U.S. government or the Obama administration apologizing for terrorists or sympathizing with them. What I heard from the President and Secretary Clinton was a very definite rejection of terrorism. And, of course, our government's going to call on the Egyptian and Libyan governments to apprehend these people and to put them on trial. So I just think that Governor Romney has, in a very unwise way, injected himself into a situation where he clearly doesn't have all the facts.
Ambassador Burns, where did we first meet? What was the first White House you worked in?
I worked for both Republican and Democratic administrations.
I think I met you in the Bush administration.
George H.W. Bush.
George Herbert Walker Bush.
Exactly.
Bush 41 is when I first met you. You were a Russian expert?
Yes.
I believe working with Condoleezza Rice?
I was.
And Brent Scowcroft?
Yes.
Hardly an Obama partisan. I don't know whom you've endorsed. We haven't talked about that. We usually talk about foreign policy. I don't know if you've endorsed anyone in this campaign.
Well, Andrea, I was a Foreign Service officer myself for nearly 27 years. I served both Republican and Democratic administrations, and I think it's really important that we not play politics with this. We have American lives at stake overseas. Our embassies, you know, they're outposts on the front lines in very dangerous places. We rely on the security provided by host governments as well as our own security. And so this is a time actually to support our government and not to cast allegations that frankly are unsubstantiated, because I see our administration, this administration, as being very tough-minded about terrorism in the last 24 hours in responding to these events.
Is there anything that you think the administration should have done differently?
I'm not going to second-guess the administration. I wasn't at those in Benghazi or in Cairo yesterday, and I have great sympathy for the American diplomats who were there and had to face these terrible attacks on them, violent attacks with RPGs and mortars and grenades. And so I think we ought to give our support to those people. But I do think we've got to recognize, and I think Secretary Clinton put it very well this morning, she unequivocally said that there is never a justification for violence and terrorism. There's no explanation for it, and we've got to oppose it. But she also said that, you know, we've also got to deplore the intentional efforts of those who would denigrate the religious beliefs of others. And we respect the constitutional rights of freedom of speech of a person making a film. We don't have to agree with that person. And so tolerance for a religion that is 1/7 of humankind, 1 billion Muslims in the world, is also an important American principle. And I actually thought the Secretary Clinton statement was balanced, it was wise, and it said what an American official statement should say.
I don't think you had the privilege of working with the ambassador who was killed, but just as a retired ambassador and longtime Foreign Service officer, what is the impact on the Corps, the diplomatic corps, of this kind of loss? We haven't suffered this kind of a loss. Every loss is horrible and tragic on a personal and professional level, but we have not lost a U.S. ambassador who is a symbol of the U.S. government since 1979 in Afghanistan.
It's since we lost Ambassador Dubs, Adolph Spike Dubs, in 1979. We've had black days in the past, Andrea. I remember the Beirut bombings in 1983. And you do too. This is a terrible day for us. We lost 4 great individuals who were serving their country. And I think, you know, sometimes it's difficult for people to understand what diplomats do. But what they do is they go to the most difficult places. They're unarmed. Of course, they have security, but they're not carrying arms. They're doing the work of our country, and they deserve our respect and thanks today. I think that's where we should be placing this debate. The debate that I see over the last hour, which is politics and the presidential campaign, is so disappointing. But I can tell you one thing, the men and women of the Foreign Service will rally around each other, and they'll continue to serve this country with great distinction.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Nick Burns.
Thank you.
And joining me now, Congressman Mike Rogers, Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, former FBI man. Thank you, Congressman, for joining us today. Your thoughts on the level of debate and the fact that, frankly, the Republican candidate for president took a stance and said that there was an apology from the administration and put it at the feet of the president, called it disgraceful, when in fact that statement from the Cairo embassy, whether it was worded well or not, came out 6 hours before these protests even started.
Well, I do think there's room for discussion after we get through these very troubling few days about maybe policies overall and those kinds of discussions, and that's probably a fair debate to have in this upcoming election. What we should be focused on now, I think, is the fact that we lost a United States ambassador, and what's key about this is we ask these folks to serve in very dangerous places. They are civilians there to represent the United States and just fundamentally try to avoid conflict. And so the fact that these folks were deliberately targeted, they knew that the ambassador wouldn't be armed, tells us we've got some troubles that we're going to have to deal with. especially in Libya. This was a well-armed, well-coordinated event. It had both indirect and direct fire, and it had military maneuvers that were all part of this very organized attack. That's concerning, and that means we are going to have to make sure, working with the Libyans, hopefully, that these folks are brought to justice very swiftly. We cannot allow this to stand for the United States. Egypt, and I caution some on Egypt, and even the ambassador talked about this film being the impetus for this. I'm not convinced yet. We saw with the cartoons in the past that months went by, and then there were information operations put together around those cartoons to incite violence. We have a lot more questions about what exactly happened in Egypt, if in fact that there wasn't some information operation to incite violence against the United States Embassy. And I think before we draw any conclusions about what the spark or the trigger of that event, I think we need to know those answers so that we can appropriately ask the Egyptians what happened, why they didn't secure the perimeter of our embassy in Egypt. And we're going to have some repairing to do in this relationship as we move forward. The Egyptians need to take a very strong stance on this. I hope that they will. I know that we're working with them to that end, and this all has to happen fairly quickly to regain Americans' confidence in the new Egyptian government.
You're talking about, of course, the breach of the Cairo embassy and the second incident, obviously, in Benghazi and Libya. Let me play what Mitt Romney had to say this morning about the Cairo incident.
I also believe the administration was wrong to stand by a statement sympathizing with those who had breached our embassy in Egypt, instead of condemning their actions.
I'm not clear at all. I don't understand what Mitt Romney is talking about, because it was a Cairo embassy press statement 6 hours before the breach of the embassy. So where is this sympathy statement?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what Governor Romney was specifically talking about. I think probably what you saw there was the frustration over a foreign policy that probably is a little out of kilter where I think the governor would be when it comes to the Middle East. I think that's probably what you're seeing there.
Well, let me take you to Israel then, because there was also a fuss over whether or not the administration should have invited Prime Minister Netanyahu when he comes to New York in 2 weeks for the UN, and Israel saying that they had requested a meeting, the White House saying that there was no meeting requested or denied. The president called Netanyahu. You were actually present in Israel and know firsthand just how tense this relationship is.
Yeah, and it's concerning. We have, it's clear that on our intelligence and military cooperation is exceptionally good. That continues to be the case. But there is, I think, just a misfiring here between the very senior political levels in Israel and the United States that is starting to show, and that you can't hold that in for very long when the consequence of this relationship may mean, and how it's handled, a war in the Middle East. That Israel believes that they have to take some action against a nuclear Iran that, by the way, would spark a Middle East arms race, a nuclear arms race. I mean, the consequences of this are huge.
You're the intelligence chair. Do you agree that the time now has run out on sanctions and that Israel has to take military action?
Here's where I think we stand today. I think Israel believes with their capabilities, they may, in fact, have already crossed their line, and they're looking to the United States for a little guidance. I do believe that's all happening, and that's why all this confusion and tension and anxiety between the two relationships, which is not healthy, by the way. My argument is, it's not just if the Israelis believe that there's a real military option on the table, but what do the Iranians believe? I believe today, as a member of the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, the Iranians don't believe that the United States is serious. The administration has spent a lot of effort trying to convince Israel not to do it, and what I was hoping is a better example for the Iranians that, listen, if you continue to push this nuclear, to try to get a nuclear weapon, there are real consequences. I think the sanctions, which I supported and Congress supported candidly, are having some impact, but they're not having an impact on slowing down the program. That's when the real threat of military option has to be on the table. Not that we want to use it, but I believe in peace through strength. And I think the Iranians understand that strength part. So I think we've just got to, it's not a lost opportunity. I think we can still get all of these players back on the table so that we can have a very real deterrent to a nuclear Iran and still have peace and good relationship with one of our strongest allies in the region, Israel.
Chairman Mike Rogers, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks,
Thank you. And up next, the politics, reaction from the Romney campaign with former ambassador and Romney senior advisor Richard Williamson. And still ahead, New York Mayor Mike Bloomberg joins us. But first, the scene just moments ago at the White House as the flag is lowered to honor our diplomats killed in Libya. You're watching Andrea Mitchell Reports, only on MSNBC.